Something just happened in the Pacific that most American newsrooms are either too afraid to cover honestly or too captured to understand. China didn't just provoke Japan, it crossed a threshold that Tokyo has been watching with quiet, restrained fury for years, and when Japan struck back, it wasn't impulsive, it wasn't emotional, it was calculated, deliberate, and, if you understand the deeper architecture of power in East Asia, completely inevitable. Here's what nobody is telling you. This moment wasn't born overnight. It was built through years of territorial pressure, economic coercion, and a systematic Chinese strategy to psychologically exhaust its neighbors into submission. Japan absorbed it, studied it, and then, when the moment was undeniable, responded with a precision that should make every power in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels stop and recalibrate. Because when a nation like Japan says enough, the entire global order listens, and you should too. Let me take you back to something that most Western analysts conveniently skip over when they try to explain what's happening between China and Japan right now. They want to make this about a single incident, a naval confrontation, an airspace violation, a diplomatic insult. They want to package it into a neat 60-second headline and move on. But that's not how geopolitics works. That's not how power works. And if you've been following this channel for any length of time, you already know that the real story is never the one they lead with. The real story here is about a decades-long compression. Think of it like a spring. You press it down day after day, year after year, and from the outside it looks still. It looks passive. People walk by and say, look, nothing's happening. But what's actually happening is that energy is accumulating, pressure is building, and the moment that spring releases, the force it generates is not proportional to what you see in that single moment. It's proportional to everything that was compressed into it over time. That is precisely what we are witnessing with Japan right now. China's strategy in the Pacific has never been subtle to those paying attention. It has been a slow, methodical, and extraordinarily patient campaign to reshape the maritime boundaries of East Asia in its favor. Not through open war. Beijing is far too sophisticated for that, at least in the conventional sense. Instead, it works through what strategists call salami slicing. You take a thin slice here, a reef there. You send a Coast Guard vessel into disputed waters, then 2 vessels, then a fleet. You conduct a military exercise close to a neighbor's coastline, not quite close enough to be an act of war, but close enough to send an unmistakable message. And you repeat this process over and over until the new reality has been normalized, until what was once unacceptable becomes, through sheer repetition, accepted. Japan has watched this happen to the Philippines. It has watched China transform rocks and reefs in the South China Sea into fully operational military bases equipped with runways, radar systems, and anti-ship missile batteries. It has watched Chinese vessels harass Filipino fishermen in waters that international tribunals have ruled belong to Manila. It has watched Beijing simply ignore those rulings with a wave of its hand, as if international law is something that applies to everyone else but not to China. And Japan has taken careful, detailed notes on every single one of these episodes, because Japan understands something that Washington's think tanks still struggle to articulate clearly. What China does to its weaker neighbors today, it will attempt to do to its stronger neighbors tomorrow. The Senkaku Islands, what China calls the Diaoyu Islands, have been at the center of this tension for years. These are a small cluster of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea, and on a map, they don't look like much. But in the language of maritime power, they are enormously significant. Whoever controls those islands controls the surrounding waters, the fishing rights, the potential energy resources beneath the seabed, and, the most critically, a strategic position that matters enormously in any future military confrontation in the region. China knows this, Japan knows this, and the United States, which has explicitly stated that the Senkaku Islands fall under the Mutual Defense Treaty it holds with Japan, absolutely knows this. What China did, and I want you to understand the full weight of this, it was not simply sail a few vessels into contested waters. That has been happening with increasing frequency for years. What China did this time crossed a line that Japan had, up until this moment, chosen not to publicly respond to with the full force of its capability. Chinese naval and coast guard assets moved into what Japan considers its territorial waters, not as a patrol, not as a transit, but as a sustained, deliberate, and coordinated presence designed to demonstrate one thing above all else, that Japan could not stop them. That Japan's sovereignty over those waters was, in Beijing's view, a fiction. A courtesy that China was no longer obligated to observe. Now, here is where you need to understand something about Japanese strategic culture that most American commentators completely miss because they apply Western, and particularly American, frameworks to a civilization that operates on entirely different principles. Japan does not respond to provocation the way the United States does. America's instinct, shaped by its history, its geography, its self-image as an exceptional nation, is to respond loudly, visibly, and immediately. Carrier groups, press conferences, sanctions packages announced with fanfare. Japan is not like that. Japan watches, Japan studies, Japan calculates with a patience and a depth that goes back centuries. And when Japan decides it is time to act, it does not act to make a statement. It acts to produce a specific, measurable, strategic result. Tokyo's response was not a single action. It was a coordinated, multi-layered strategic move that operated simultaneously on the military, diplomatic, economic, and legislative dimensions. And it was executed with a precision that should genuinely unsettle Beijing's planners. On the military side, Japan scrambled its self-defense forces in a manner and at a scale that made clear this was not a routine response. Japan has been quietly, methodically building its military capability over the past several years in ways that have not received nearly enough coverage in Western media. The defense budget increases that Tokyo authorized, moving toward 2% of GDP, which for Japan's economy represents a staggering sum of money, have been translated into real, tangible capability: new long-range strike missiles, enhanced submarine warfare capacity, expanded radar and surveillance infrastructure across the southwestern island chain. Japan did not build these capabilities as a deterrent in the abstract sense. It built them to use if necessary, and the signal it sent to Beijing in this moment was that it is entirely prepared to do exactly that. But here is what makes Japan's response genuinely significant beyond the military dimension. Tokyo simultaneously activated its diplomatic networks with a speed and sophistication that caught many observers off guard. Japanese officials were on the phone with counterparts in Washington, Seoul, Canberra, Manila, and New Delhi within hours, not asking for permission, not requesting guidance, informing them of what Japan was doing and framing it explicitly in terms of the shared interests of every nation in the Indo-Pacific that has a stake in a rules-based regional order. This is Japan redefining its own role in the region, not as a nation that defers to American leadership on every significant security question, but as a nation that is prepared to take initiative, build coalitions, and project its own strategic will. That is a profound shift, and it has been building for years under the pressure of exactly the kind of Chinese behavior we're discussing. Now let's talk about the economic dimension, because this is where things get truly interesting and where most commentary falls completely flat. China and Japan are deeply economically intertwined. Japan is one of China's largest trading partners. Japanese companies have enormous investments on the Chinese mainland. The supply chains connecting these two economies are extraordinarily complex and in many sectors extraordinarily difficult to unwind quickly. Beijing has historically used this economic interdependence as a form of leverage, the implicit threat being that if Japan pushes too hard, China can inflict serious economic pain in response. For years, this calculation has functioned as a brake on Japanese assertiveness. Tokyo has been careful not to push so hard that Beijing decides to make an economic example of it. What Japan's response signals, and this is the part that I think is genuinely historic, is that Tokyo has made a strategic decision to begin reducing that vulnerability, even at significant short-term economic cost. The diversification of Japanese supply chains away from China has been accelerating. Japanese investment in Southeast Asia, in India, in other parts of the world has been increasing precisely to reduce the economic leverage that Beijing holds. And in the context of Japan's response to this specific incident, Tokyo made it clear through back channels and through the statements of its trade and economic officials that it is prepared to absorb economic friction rather than continue to allow economic interdependence to function as a constraint on its sovereign decisions. That is an enormous statement. That is a nation deciding that the price of strategic independence is worth paying, and paying now before the leverage gap becomes even wider. Let me connect this to something bigger, because what's happening between China and Japan is not an isolated bilateral dispute. It is a microcosm of the fundamental contest that is reshaping the entire global order right now. We are living through the end of the unipolar moment, the period following the Cold War when American power was so dominant that it effectively set the rules, enforced the norms, and determined the boundaries of acceptable behavior for every other significant actor on the world stage. That moment is over. Not because America has collapsed, it hasn't, but because other powers have grown, have organized, have developed the capabilities and the confidence to pursue their own interests in ways that no longer require American approval. China is the most significant of these rising powers, but it is not the only one. And the friction we are seeing in the East China Sea is one of many fault lines along which the new global order is being negotiated, not in conference rooms with diplomats sipping mineral water, but in contested waters with naval vessels and missile systems and the raw, unambiguous language of capability and will. What China miscalculated, and I believe Beijing genuinely miscalculated here, which is itself significant, is the degree to which Japan has already psychologically and strategically moved past the post-war constraints that have shaped its foreign policy for decades. Since the end of World War II, Japan has operated under a pacifist constitutional framework that limited the role of its military forces and more broadly reflected a national consensus that Japan should never again project military power in ways that could be seen as threatening to its neighbors. That consensus has been eroding for years, driven not by Japanese aggression or imperial nostalgia, but by the straightforward rational response of a sophisticated nation to a deteriorating security environment. When China builds military bases in the South China Sea, when North Korea fires missiles over Japanese territory, when Russian and Chinese bombers conduct joint patrols near Japanese airspace, Japan does not have the option of pretending the world is still 1995. It has to respond to the world as it actually is, and the world as it actually is demands a Japan that is capable of defending itself and its interests without waiting for permission. There is a moral dimension to this story that I want to be careful about because it's easy to get this wrong and easy for the conversation to slide into a kind of reflexive China bashing that is both intellectually lazy and strategically counterproductive. China is a great civilization with a legitimate set of interests and a legitimate desire for respect and recognition in the international system. The humiliations of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties, the foreign concessions carved out of Chinese territory left deep marks on Chinese national consciousness and understanding that history is essential to understanding why Beijing behaves the way it does today. The desire to restore what China sees as its rightful place in the world is not irrational, it is not monstrous, it is deeply human. But, and this is the critical but, the way in which a nation pursues its interests matters enormously. The methods China has chosen in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, the coercion, the disregard for international legal rulings, the use of economic power to punish smaller nations that dare to stand up for their rights, these methods are corrosive to exactly the kind of international order that ultimately benefits China as much as anyone else. A world in which the strong simply take what they want from the weak is not a world in which China, for all its power, can thrive indefinitely. Because the logic that permits China to ignore international rulings on the South China Sea is the same logic that other powers can invoke to ignore international norms that protect Chinese interests. You cannot build a stable, prosperous international order on the principle that might makes right. History has tried that experiment many times, and it always ends the same way. Japan understands this, and Japan's response to China's crossing of that unforgivable line is, at its deepest level, a defense not just of Japanese sovereignty over a cluster of islands in the East China Sea, but of the principle that international norms are not optional, that smaller nations have rights, that the rules apply to everyone, including the powerful. This is why Japan's response has resonated so strongly across the Indo-Pacific, and why the coalition that Tokyo is building finds willing partners from Manila to New Delhi to Canberra, because every nation in that region faces some version of the same challenge. Every nation in that region is watching what happens next with the understanding that the outcome will shape the environment in which they all have to live for decades to come. The question now, and the question that will define the trajectory of East Asian security for the foreseeable future, is how Beijing responds. Does it escalate, doubling down on the pressure in the belief that Japan will eventually blink? Does it recalibrate, reading Japan's response as a genuine signal that the old rules of the game have changed? Or does it pursue the most dangerous path of all, the path of a power that has convinced itself so thoroughly of its own narrative that it is no longer capable of accurately reading the signals it is receiving from the outside world? I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. But I will tell you this. The fact that Japan struck back and struck back mercilessly is one of the most significant strategic signals to emerge from the Indo-Pacific in a very long time. It tells us that the compression has ended. The spring has released, and the force it has released is not proportional to this single incident. It is proportional to everything that was compressed into it over years and years of patient, calculated, restrained accumulation. The Pacific has changed. The question is whether the rest of the world is paying close enough attention to understand what that means.